Good morning. My name is Julie Olds. I am the Director of Community Relations and Education at Schoedinger Funeral and Cremation Service. Today we are talking about how to talk about funeral preferences. This was the first presentation in the series Plain Talk, co-sponsored by COAAA. So when talking about funerals, there's a couple things that we need to think about. First, what about grief? I think oftentimes that gets overlooked in the entire process as we are talking about funerals. Why is it hard to talk about? Why are funerals so important? What do you really want? How do I tell my family without alarming them? Should I pre-plan? And how can I ensure that my wishes will be honored? So back in the 1970s, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with a theory called the 5 stages of grief. And it was the first in looking at how people respond to loss. She was a pioneer in the whole grief awareness process that has carried forward to what we have today. And with her 5 stages of grief, it was the first look at what people might go through after there's been a loss, starting with denial, going through anger, bargaining, depression, and ending with acceptance. However, in today's world, there are many great grief theorists that have different ideas about how we cope with loss. One of those great theorists is Dr. Alan Wolfelt. And Dr. Alan Wolfelt believes that we have to go through encountering experiences to reach reconciliation after there's been a loss. Our natural tendency is to evade pain, to avoid it at all possible costs. But when we avoid the pain of loss, we end up bottling it up. And the idea is that that grief, that pain will manifest at some point in time, but it may not be when we want it to. So if we have an opportunity to encounter our grief, then we can reach reconciliation. Because the idea that people actually reach acceptance after there's been a loss has gone away. That theory's gone now. But we have an opportunity to reconcile because nobody ever goes back to normal after there's been a loss. People reach a new normal. Oftentimes, their roles within a family changes. Where there may have been 2 parents, now there's only 1, and the surviving parent has to act as both mother and father. Where there's been a relationship, a couple, a loving relationship, where 2 people have gone through life together, now there's just 1. So the many opportunities that people have to encounter their grief will allow them to reach reconciliation. The best way to describe that is when there has been a loss. For example, if somebody was at home on hospice and they passed away at home with family, hospice is there with the family to help do what needs to be done so that the funeral home can come and take their loved one into their care. And that family is there encountering their grief. After the funeral home has left the house, after hospice has left the house, the family is left alone. They will do things to evade their grief. Then the family needs to go back to the funeral home to make funeral arrangements. They're there sitting with the funeral director, talking about the life that was lived. They are encountering their grief. After the funeral arrangement process, the family goes home. Perhaps they go out to dinner. They call friends. They do things to evade their grief. And then on the day of services, when they're there at the funeral home with their loved one and friends and family have gathered to honor the deceased, they are encountering their grief. And those rites and rituals that the family goes through during the process is the importance of the funeral service. Alan Wolfelt has a great quote. He says, "I have seen many people in counseling who at the time of death thought it would be easier not to have a funeral service. They end up trying to go around their grief instead of through it, resulting in what I term living in the shadow of the ghosts of grief. So what is it about grief? Grief is a multifaceted response to loss, particularly to the loss of someone or something that has died, to which a bond or affection was formed. People experience an emotional response to loss, but it also has physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions. And the one thing mainly to remember is that grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional and physical and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to go through it. So everyone grieves differently. And as the Director of Community Relations and Education for Schoedinger, I have seen through my years of experience that there are many different responses to grief. Sometimes people are relieved, especially if a loved one has been suffering. They feel that now they're not suffering anymore. Sometimes I've seen people who are angry that their loved one has left them, angry that their loved one can't be there to support them anymore. Sometimes the family may be happy. And the thing to remember is that we don't know the backstory. We don't know what that family has been through. But whatever that family is experiencing, whatever emotions they may be feeling, is what they should be feeling. And we need to accept that and let them grieve as they will. So there are many different types of grief. Anticipatory grief is grief before the loss associated with a diagnosis of acute, chronic, or terminal illness. So the best way to describe anticipatory grief is when you have a couple and one of them is an Alzheimer's or dementia unit. The well spouse experiences anticipatory grief because there's already been somewhat of a loss. That person who is in the Alzheimer's or dementia unit is not the person that they've married, but technically they're still married. So there's been a loss before there's been a loss from death. With delayed grief, it's normal grief reactions that are suppressed or postponed, possibly avoiding the pain of loss. So for delayed grief, the best way to describe that is right after the Sandy Hook incident, where all those children were murdered. The local news service interviewed the funeral home, the funeral director that was in that town, and they asked him, "You know these families, you've known many of the children. How are you dealing with your own grief and loss?" And he said, "I'm not." He said, "My focus right now is to help these families get through all of these funeral services. Once I've done that, then I can grieve." That's a really good example of delayed grief. Disenfranchised grief is when a loss is experienced that can't be openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, or publicly shared. A good example of disenfranchised grief is pet loss. Some people don't understand how someone could grieve so deeply for the loss of just an animal. There are many other examples of disenfranchised grief, but the idea to remember is that it's a grief felt that can't be openly expressed. Another good example would be a family whose son or daughter had completed suicide, and they are having a funeral service for that. With exaggerated grief, emotional expressions of grief are beyond what is considered normal. So when you encounter somebody who's grieving and they are wailing or they are openly expressing their emotions to what we would consider excessive for the norm, that's considered exaggerated grief. With chronic grief, it's normal grief reactions that do not subside. The thing with chronic grief is that people believe that your grief will go away, that in time you should be better. The idea behind chronic grief is that it doesn't go away. Unfortunately, in many instances, people think that in a few months they should be feeling better, and they're not. They go to their doctor. The doctor prescribes antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. The problem with that is that grief is not a disease or a disorder, and those medications are not helping that person go through their grief, which we just learned from Dr. Alan Wolfeld. With masked grief, people are unaware that they're behaving differently or exhibiting different signs of grief. So if you encounter someone say in your workforce who is behaving differently after there's been a loss, perhaps a loss in their family, or perhaps a loss of a patient or someone that they cared for, they can't see that they're behaving differently, but you can. That is masked grief. Compassionate grief is what caregivers feel after they've lost a patient. So hospice workers, folks who work in skilled nursing facilities, often experience compassionate grief, especially if they have had the opportunity to get to know the patient, the deceased, very well. And compound grief is an example where there's been a loss, and before that person has gotten through a grief period, there's been another loss, and then there's been another loss, compounding the grief that that person may have experienced. And that's compound grief. So why is it hard to talk about? Well, the reality is in North America, we are experiencing a phenomena unlike other places in the world, and that is an avid denial of death and grief. And so the researchers in death and dying and bereavement did a study to try and figure out why North American societies are death-denying and grief-denying societies, and they came up with the denial of death thesis. There are several reasons why this could be the case. So the first reason is that there's a fear about talking about death. We actually had a gentleman come into the funeral home who lived in a group home, and when he's living in the group home, he's living on Medicaid. And with that situation, whenever a person comes into money and they are on Medicaid, they cannot keep that money. So the case managers and social workers for this gentleman brought him into the funeral home to make his funeral arrangements, because that's considered a qualified spend down. So they were sitting there with this gentleman and they said, "Okay, George, we're here to make your funeral arrangements so that when the time comes, everything will be taken care of and you won't have to worry about how your funeral is going to be covered. So why don't you go ahead and tell the funeral director exactly what you want for your funeral services?" And George just sat there. And they said, "Well, George, maybe you have questions about the difference between burial and cremation. Maybe you have concerns about costs. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask the funeral director, and then we can go ahead and get your wishes on paper." And George just sat there. And they said, "Well, George, we're here to make your funeral arrangements for you, but you're not saying anything. Why is that?" And he said, "Because if I talk about it, it's going to happen sooner." So it is a real fear, a real phobia. The second reason is that death has become highly medicalized. People are living longer through medications, treatments, and can be kept alive longer by artificial means. So what used to be a very normal end to life has now become a very medicalized end to life. The third reason is the segregation of the dying from the rest of society. So there are hospices in town who have opened special hospice facilities where families can go to be with their loved ones as they are in the dying process. They're beautiful facilities, and they're very comforting for the families who are able to use those resources. But it does segregate the dying from the rest of society. You think about just a moment when a family's elder parent starts to experience changes in their health care, one of the first conversations that they have is nursing home. Well, again, a nursing home, although they do wonderful in caring for the elderly, it does segregate them from the rest of society. Number 4, the decline in mourning rituals. So let me paint a picture for you. 100 years ago, when a person died, most often they died at home. There were funeral directors back then. They were called morticians or undertakers. And they would come to the home and they would embalm the body right there in the bed. The men of the family then were responsible for transporting that body into the coffin in the parlor, which is our living rooms today, which is also where the term funeral parlor came from. The women of the family were responsible for all of the flowers and the cooking, because you always had cooking around funeral services. The church was involved before the person even passed, so that they would be there to be able to administer last rites. Black curtains were hung in the windows. Support from family and friends were always around the death and the funeral service. Nowadays, how is a funeral service conducted? What types of rites and rituals? Who's responsible? Oftentimes, the funeral home is responsible for all of those things that the family used to be responsible for. Another reason in decline in mourning rituals is cost. People believe that cremation or no services are less expensive and choose that option instead of funeral services. And in reality, funeral services are very affordable for any family. And finally, the increase in families selecting grief-denying funeral services. This is a situation where many of you have been working with the elderly, and they will say, I don't want anything fancy. I don't want my family to experience that pain. I don't want them to have to deal with the cost. And all of these things comes from a place of love by the person who is saying it without realizing that the funeral service is for the living. And so oftentimes, family feels obligated to honor mom or dad's wishes when mom says, I don't want anything. I don't want a funeral service. I don't want my family to go through that. And the family will select that to honor mom's wishes. So those reasons are why it is so hard to talk about, according to the denial of death thesis. So again, the idea behind why it's hard to talk about, people are great procrastinators. I have often heard situations where people say, I'm young, I'm healthy. Why do I need to talk about that? People want to spare their families the pain and sadness. I don't want my family to have to go through that. Just cremate me with no services. People have a difficult time justifying cost. I don't want my family to spend a lot of money when no one will come to my funeral. An interesting statistic regarding people who attend funerals is that 60% of the people who attend a funeral service didn't even know the deceased. They are there to support the survivors, the family. So when it comes to the rituals, throughout recorded history, all peoples across the planet have rites and rituals around major life events. There are rites and rituals around birth, around coming of age, around marriage or a union, and around death. And recently, we found out that archaeologists have discovered evidence of rituals surrounding death before there were even written records or accounts. And it's based on how they found the bodies that were buried. So it's very interesting to know that there's been these rites and rituals around death and funeral services for as long as there's been human life. So why are funerals so important? A good funeral gets the dead where they need to go and the living where they need to be. Think about that for just a second. A good funeral does what we need to do to take care of the body, but it also helps the family to get where they need to be. So, why have a funeral service then? Well, a funeral acknowledges the death and gives friends and family an opportunity to come together to support each other in grief. Because according to Rabbi Earl Grolman, grief shared is grief diminished. So the idea that the great grief theorists have nowadays is that you need to tell your grief story 100 times before you can truly begin to heal, before you can truly begin to reconcile with that loss. So for families that choose not to have funeral services, then every time they go to the grocery store and they run into somebody they know, "Oh, I heard about your father. I'm so sorry." They have to tell their grief story. The next time they go to church and someone comes up to them and says, "I understand you lost a parent. I'm so sorry for your loss." And they have to tell their grief story. Or at a PTA meeting, or the next time they're at softball practice, or any number of situations that's not the funeral, they will have to tell that grief story. So at a funeral service, when you have all of your friends and family gathered around you to support you after there's been a loss, you can tell your grief story to all of those people and you could begin to heal. Without services, you don't have that opportunity. So the purpose then of funeral service is transcendence, number one. Transcendence can help us embrace the wonder of life and death. It creates meaning and marks the significance of the life that was lived and help us find meaning and purpose in our continued living. It helps us express how we feel, what feelings we have about the death and the loss. It can bring people together to support each other, help recall and remember the life that was lived, and acknowledge the reality that that person is gone. So what do you want? What do you really want? According to a survey of Californians at the California Healthcare Foundation, 60% of surveyed adults say that making sure their family is not burdened by tough decisions is extremely important. Yet, 56% have not talked to their families about their wishes. 82% of surveyed adults say it's important to put their wishes in writing, yet only 23% have actually done so. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between burial and cremation. So a funeral service is where the body is present. Most grief experts believe that families need to see the body to have the best healing experience. Memorial services are where the body is not present. Cremation is conducted prior to the actual funeral, the actual memorial service. So that's the difference between funeral and memorial service. Now let's talk about disposition. So disposition simply refers to the manner in which human remains are finally handled. And there are different types of disposition. We have burial, cremation, entombment, which is much like the cemeteries you see down in New Orleans, where the crypt is above ground. That is entombment. And then body donation is pretty self-explanatory. And then we have alkaline hydrolysis. So in the state of Ohio, burial, cremation, entombment, and body donation are the recognized forms of disposition. In other parts of the country, alkaline hydrolysis is also an accepted form. And what alkaline hydrolysis is basically a water cremation. The body is placed inside a chamber, and water and lye are added to literally dissolve the body down to tiny bone fragments, which are then ground up to have cremated remains. So it's a water cremation, alkaline hydrolysis. It is not recognized in the state of Ohio, but that may change. So options for families. When a family comes into the funeral home to sit down with the funeral director to make arrangements, whatever they request, the funeral directors are going to try to do. As long as it's legal and we're able to do it, families can have whatever services they need to help with their healing experience. So they can have a traditional funeral service, a memorial service, a service with reception, graveside service, service at a church, or even alternate locations. And personalization means that our funeral directors work with families to create services that tell the story of the deceased and honor the life that was lived. Recently, we had the opportunity to have a service for a gentleman who was a mall Santa. and our funeral director was able to bring reindeer to the chapel and decorate the funeral home with Christmas trees and presents and ornaments in honor of this person's life. It truly was a healing experience for the family. Well, how do I tell my family? How do I talk to my family about what I want, what my preferences are, what my wishes are? Well, as we age, we encounter situations and experiences that cause us to face our own mortality. I myself had one not too long ago where I participated in a funeral service at one of our local chapels, and the service was for a woman who was 52 years old. She was driving her van, and a drunk driver crossed the median on the freeway, hit her head on, and killed her instantly. So at the funeral service was her husband and her 2 children, a son and a daughter. And as I stood there and watched this funeral service, it could have been my own, because she was my age. Her husband was my husband's age, and her children were the same age as my 2 children. So I was literally facing my own mortality. It's natural to think about what we want for ourselves and families. Talking about our preferences to family is a gift. Parents tell their children their wishes. We recently had the opportunity to sit with my in-laws and have their funeral arrangements taken care of for them. Children have the opportunity to ask parents what their wishes are. And what about pre-planning? Is that an option? Is that something that people should consider? Well, pre-planning for your funeral allows you to record your final wishes. It helps to ensure that family knows what you want for your funeral services. It also helps the funeral home know what to do when they need to carry out your wishes. Because honestly, no family has ever come back to the funeral home and said, "I wish she hadn't planned ahead." Other reasons why people pre-plan: together versus alone. We had 2 young ladies come into the funeral home to take care of funeral arrangements for one of them. Her name was Sue. So Sue was there, and her best friend, Betsy, and they were arranging Sue's funeral. And I was curious because Sue was only 46 at the time. And I said, "You seem kind of young. Why are you here?" And she said, "Sue's been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And we want to go ahead and get these funeral arrangements taken care of now instead of at the time, because at the time it's going to be too hard." So together, these 2 ladies completely planned out Sue's funeral. Another reason why people plan ahead is it's a Medicaid spend-down. So a prepaid funeral arrangement is a qualified spend-down for Medicaid. Now, Medicaid rules and regulations have changed regarding spend-down for reimbursement purposes, but for a long-term care situation where a person is having to spend down through all of their assets to be able to qualify to go on long-term Medicaid, a prepaid funeral plan is a qualified spend-down. I caution you, though, you really don't know how many families have come into the funeral home and said, "Well, we know mom's going to need to go on Medicaid, so the social worker at the nursing home told us to come get her funeral arrangements." And then only to find out there's a few $1,000s left. It's better to encourage families in a Medicaid situation or potential Medicaid situation to get to the funeral home early on in the spend-down process. There's also personalized selection. Again, I have seen funeral services that were bowling themed, Sound of Music themed, Buckeye themed. I have seen situations where people have requested special arrangements for quilts in the funeral home, artwork, Harley Davidson, motorcycles. Honestly, whatever the family needs to make that funeral a healing opportunity for them, that's what we will do to personalize for them. A prepaid funeral helps reduce the impact of inflation. So when a funeral is planned at an at-need situation, the person has passed and the family is there making funeral arrangements, the expectation is that the funeral will be paid for prior to the actual day of services. That's the expectation. So if it's a situation where a person might think that they would struggle to have the services that they want, they can actually prepay for a funeral and have affordable payment options. By prepaying a funeral, most funeral homes will guarantee the costs of their products and services will not go up, even if the person doesn't pass for another 20, 30 years. The things that will change in cost are things that are out of control of the funeral home, such as flower arrangements, obituaries, death certificates, honorariums for preachers or pastors. So that's where the reducing inflation comes into play. That's also where savings comes into play then, because through affordable payment options, a person can take care of their funeral arrangements long before it's actually needed. It also prevents emotional spending in that sometimes when there's been a sudden death, a death that the family was not prepared for, the typical response is, we just want the best. I don't care how much it costs. We just want the best for mom. And that's not always the wisest, because one thing we don't want to do is create a funeral service for a family that some point in time they're going to regret. So we really try to work hard to be able to help that family with exactly what they need and no more. And finally, peace of mind. Again, no family has ever come back to the funeral home and said they wished mom had not pre-planned. So how do we ensure that our wishes will be honored? Talk to your family about what you want. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen any sooner. Encourage them to share their thoughts and feelings, because again, the funeral service is for the living. Complete your advanced funeral arrangements and complete an Ohio form of appointment for representative. So this particular document, the Ohio Appointment of Representative for Disposition of Bodily Remains, Funeral Arrangements, and Burial or Cremation Goods and Services. Big, long title for a very simple document. This document designates one person to be solely responsible for your final wishes, kind of like a power of attorney post-death. Now, we all know that powers of attorney and guardianship end when the person dies. This is the one document that carries forward after the death and helps to ensure that funeral arrangements are taken care of, or that your wishes are honored. It minimizes the risk of family indecision, and it supersedes next of kin rules. So next of kin rules then are, if I pass away, my husband is responsible for my funeral arrangements. At the same time, if my dependent child passes away, I'm responsible for that child's funeral arrangements. Beyond that, it follows a line of family relations all the way down to distant cousins that you may have never met or never even seen before. That's the next of kin rules. So in a situation where perhaps the only surviving relative is that second or third cousin that lives in California that you've never even met, why not choose somebody that you trust to carry out your wishes? So here's another example. Say I'm on my third marriage to the pool boy, and it's a lot of fun and we're having a great time, but I know that this young man is not going to carry out my funeral wishes the way I want them to, but my adult son from my first marriage will. Now, because my current spouse would technically be responsible for my funeral arrangements, by appointing my adult son as my representative for disposition, he would be solely responsible for my funeral arrangements. This document is wonderful in situations where there are a lot of decision makers that can't make decisions, or in a situation where a couple, heterosexual or homosexual, has been living together but not married, that person is not recognized in the next of kin rules. So it is a wonderful document. This document can be found on the Schoedinger website as well as on the Caregiving Tree website at www.schoedinger.com or www.thecaregivingtree.com. You can download this document. It just needs to be witnessed. But I caution that when you designate somebody to be responsible for your funeral arrangements, then they are also responsible for the cost. So I encourage that if you do decide it's important to execute this document, to go ahead and get your funeral arrangements paid for in advance as well. If you have any questions about the information that was presented in this program today, feel free to call me, Julie Olds, at 614-370-9960, or you can email me at jolds@schoedinger.com. Thank you.